And what came to mind was reading recipes, as you probably Hello and welcome to my porch. My name is Roy. I am a home cook and amateur baker, and I am here on this channel sharing recipes that have helped me to lose over 125 pounds, whether those recipes are mine or someone else's. Today, obviously, I'm on the porch, but it's not for a tag. This is for one of my back to basics, and I was wondering, I'm running low on ideas for what to do with these back to basics, so I think they will be ending soon, at least until something happens to come up and I decide, oh, that's a good one, I should do that. But I was wondering what I could do, and what came to mind was reading recipes. I've mentioned certain things throughout my recipes that I've done on this channel, and I thought, why not compile that all into one video so that way I can reference it if need be and give you all of the information. This might not be a comprehensive list of what you need to know about reading recipes, but it is going to cover quite a few things that you need to know when you are reading recipes. Even if you've been following recipes for a while, you may not know why they do certain things. So I decided that I think I should spend one of these doing a little video about how to read a recipe and what certain things mean. I also was going to incorporate measuring things, but that got more involved. So actually next week I will be doing a back to basics all about measurements, about measuring different foods, about measuring liquids and dry, about converting, like if you have a quarter cup, what that equals, that kind of thing. So that will be next Monday. But for this Monday, we are going to go over reading recipes. And the first thing on the list, perhaps the most important thing, is just read the recipe. Now, I've been guilty of this myself, where I just glance at it and, oh, I got it. And then I get halfway through and realize I added something when I shouldn't have, or I didn't have something I needed. Definitely make sure that you read through the recipe. They don't take long, they take 2 minutes maybe. So what I will do is I will have a pen with me, and just as I go through the ingredients, mark off what I know I have, so that way I know what I need to pick up. I will also go through as I'm reading the directions. Sometimes there are things snuck into the directions that aren't in the ingredients, such as water. Oftentimes you won't find water in a recipe, but you may need it to thin something out or to boil pasta or whatever, but that won't be listed as part of the recipe. So I will underline any ingredients, such as water, that aren't listed in the ingredients, just so that I'm aware that I'm going to need that. You also want to make sure you check the temperature, the time range, and each part usually gives a rough estimate of the time that you're going to need. So I try to calculate, okay, this part takes 20 minutes, this part takes 10. I also have to calculate in time for prep, which, depending on how involved that is, takes 10, 15 minutes, whatever. So that way I can also get a rough idea of when to start, because when I've skimmed recipes, I've often overlooked, say, marinate the pork chops for an hour before cooking. I just saw make the marinade, use the pork chops. I didn't see the time it took to marinate them, so I didn't calculate that in. So just make sure you read through carefully. I mean, like I said, takes a minute or two to read a recipe. So just make sure you read it thoroughly so that you know what you are in for. If you're looking at a recipe and it gives you an item that has both the weight and the volume listed, it might say half a cup, and in parentheses, 50 grams, 12 ounces, whatever it is. If you see a recipe that shows both, that's just giving you a guide to how much you need to have, or if it's something baked, it's often better to use the weight rather than the volume. So say flour, it's usually better to weigh it if you can. If you can't, don't worry about it. But if you can, it's usually better to weigh it than to use, say, a cup measure. And I will talk more about that next week in the measurements video. But just know that the weight will change based on how you fill that cup. So it's best if you do have, say, flour or confectioner sugar. What I typically do, I have mine in airtight canisters. I will shake it up to aerate the flour a little bit and then measure it out. If you don't, you'll get a different measurement than I do. So that's why weighing is sometimes better, especially in baking, which can be more precise. A little calculation off here or there could affect the texture or the moistness or the dryness of the baked good. Also, you want to, as you're going through the ingredients, is there anything there that you're not familiar with? Is there anything there that is not something you typically buy? Where will you get it? Do you actually need it? Is there a replacement for it? So those kinds of things are also should come into play as you're reading through the recipe. Now, speaking of ingredients, the second thing I recommend that you do, and many people may not know this. I know there are some people who are actually writing up recipes online that don't seem to know this. But the ingredients are listed in the order that you're going to use them, typically. Like I said, I've seen some recipes that people have thrown together that have the ingredients just listed and not in the order they're used. But if you're going by a cookbook, and most of my recipes, I'm pretty sure, are all set in that way. They should be. But all of the ingredients are usually listed in the order that they're used. However, that doesn't mean that you should prep them necessarily in that order. Because say that you're doing a chicken dish and the first ingredient is the chicken. You don't want to prep the chicken on a cutting board that you're then going to have to prep vegetables on. You don't want that cross-contamination. So what I do is I check through the ingredients to see what I can prep before I prep anything like the chicken that I wouldn't want to prep anything on afterward. You can always wash the board in between. But if you are prepping, just think about how you can manage the time without having to wash things again. So I would prep all my vegetables before I do any sort of protein. If you watch any Food Network or cooking shows, you may have heard the term mise en place. And if not, don't worry, it's not common outside of cooking shows. But mise en place is a French term which just means everything in place. So mise en place is when you get all of your ingredients all set. Like when I do my videos, I have all the ingredients so that I can show you at the beginning of the video. That's my mise en place. Everything's been prepared, everything's in place. So just a little term for you to know in case you hear it, now you know what it means. Now, also while we are on the subject of the ingredients list, pay attention to the way things are worded. In particular, if there is a comma in an ingredient list, that's something to pay attention to. If there is a comma after an item, say you have an ingredient on the list that's 3/4 cup mushroom, comma, chopped. That means they want you to measure out the mushrooms, put them as they are in a cup measure, then chop them. If there is no comma and it says 3/4 cup chopped mushroom, they want you to chop it before you measure it. So just know, if you see a comma, whatever is done after the comma is done after you've measured it. So that way it doesn't throw off the proportions. So if I had 3/4 cup of mushrooms, then chopped them, I have fewer mushrooms chopped than if I had 3/4 cup of chopped mushrooms, because all those little bits, I can fit more in there. So just make sure you pay attention to that comma. Anything that comes after the comma is done after you measured the ingredient. Also, part of the ingredients may say room temperature, especially if you are baking. As I've said in many videos, when you are trying to get cold things mixed together, they're resistant to do that. They're resistant to blending. If they're room temperature, they're more relaxed, blend much more easily. So make sure you're paying attention as you're reading the recipe what would need to be at room temperature, because you want to take that out at least 20 minutes before you're going to use it. Typically, I try to take it out an hour before, but it doesn't always work out that way. But at least 20 minutes or so should get it down a little bit, but preferably you should have anything that needs to be at room temperature, or like butter that needs to be softened. You want that out about an hour before you're going to start cooking. Also, pay attention to the first item in the directions. Typically, that is going to tell you what temperature to preheat your oven at, how to prep your pan, what size pan to use, things like that. So those are usually the things that they want you to do to get ready for cooking. The oven preheating will take 15 to 20 minutes sometimes, depending on your oven. So definitely pay attention to that first item in the directions and get all of that information from there. It's definitely useful information. Now, another important thing in the directions, which is usually toward the end, is the cooking time. There's usually a range, and it could be 20 to 25 minutes, 12 to 15 minutes. It depends, because different ovens cook differently. Different stovetops cook differently. Your medium high might not be as intense as mine. So it's all based on a range that you should be checking. Maybe I usually check, say, 2 minutes before the first start of the range. So like if it says 20 to 25 minutes, I'll check something at like 18 just to see, because if my oven's too hot, it's going to be cooking it at a faster rate. So I want to make sure that I catch it ahead of time. 25 minutes, that might not be done. So just because it says 20 to 25 minutes doesn't mean it's going to be done in that range. That's just a guide. So don't take it as gospel. But more importantly than the time is, what should I be looking for? Most recipes will tell you until a toothpick comes out clean, until a toothpick comes out with moist crumbs, until it reaches an internal temperature of 165. So it will tell you not just the time range, but it'll also give you an idea. It might even just say until golden brown and set on the edges, something like that. So you have visual cues that'll let you know whether the recipe is done within that time frame, or if you needed less time or more time. Don't feel like if you've hit 25 minutes, you have to take it out, because it should be done. If it's not golden brown, don't take it out. Just pay attention to the visuals, to the smells, like garlic. If you put garlic into a pan to mix up with other vegetables, it takes about 30 seconds for it to cook through, and you're not going to get that sharp garlic flavor. Typically, a recipe will say, add garlic, stir for about 30 seconds, or until fragrant, or until you can smell the garlic, something along those lines. So if you've ever cooked with garlic, you know that once you put it in there, you don't smell anything at first. Once it's heated through, then you get that whiff, and it only takes about 30 seconds. So make sure you are paying attention to the times, but also to what they say those times should lead to. Okay, so now I'm going to do a little what's that mean section, where when you're reading a recipe and it tells you to heat oil until shimmering, what does that mean? Or if it tells you to fold egg whites into the batter, what does folding mean? And we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to fold gently to get this all incorporated. So you see how I'm going from the outside, pulling under. Just make sure all of this gets moistened. So there are a lot of terms or suggestions that you may not be quite sure of what they mean. So when you're heating oil, say, you don't want to obviously touch the oil, and usually it's so shallow you're not going to be able to temp it because you'd be touching the pan and that would throw off the temperature. So if it says to heat oil until hot, basically it means put it over medium heat for about a minute or two until you put your hand over the pan and you can feel the heat coming up from it. That's typically a good indicator that the oil is ready. If it says heat until shimmering, you'll see, like if you've looked at water with the sunlight on it and you see that little shimmer, it's got like a little ripply effect. It'll be kind of the same type of thing. You'll see a little shimmer, a little kind of heat glow, like a little ripple on the surface. If it says heat until smoking, because some want the temperature of the oil much hotter, depending on what you're doing, you will start to see some smoke, not black smoke. It should just be like a white smoke that shows you that the oil has gotten quite hot. Now the degrees on, especially of stovetop, the oven temperatures are pretty easy to figure out because it's usually 350, 375. But on the stovetop, it's sometimes a little harder. So usually if they're not marked as medium low, medium high, that kind of thing, it's usually a number range. If it's a number range, say 1 to 10, then obviously 1 to 10, you'd go halfway to about 5, 5.5 for a medium. If it's a medium low, you would probably go more for like a 3.5. If it's a low, 2.5, maybe 3. So just kind of like use the midpoint as a guide and then adjust where you need to in between. Now, speaking of oven temperatures, if you are reading a recipe from another country that uses the metric system, typically the rough estimate of the translation to Fahrenheit, which is what we use here, is about double. So say it tells you 120 degrees Celsius. That would be about 250 degrees here in Fahrenheit. If it's 180 degrees Celsius, that'd be about 350. So they're rough estimates. You can get more precise if you need to by Googling it. But typically a good rule of thumb is if it's in Celsius and you need Fahrenheit, double the number and then translate to the most typical temperature that you would use. And it's the reverse, obviously. If I give you an oven temperature in Fahrenheit and you're in England, it would be about half of what I give you in Fahrenheit. So that's a rough estimate. Okay, so one thing, cooking onions until translucent. You'll see that in a lot of recipes. And all that means is that when you first cut an onion, they're pretty white. When you cook them and they become translucent, that just means they've kind of gone a paler white, almost like you look like you could look through and see at least light coming through. which is what translucent means, light coming through. So you just want to cook them until the white has softened and become more of a pale, almost like see-through white, almost like a ghostly white. Maybe because I'm filming this on Halloween that came to mind, but it's accurate. Okay, another one that might throw people off is when it says to cook vegetables until tender. How do you know when it's tender? So the rule of thumb there is if you can poke it with a fork and the fork goes in easily without having to force it in, that is tender. Sometimes you'll see one that says crisp tender because they want to have a little of that raw vegetable bite. Sometimes with broccoli or cauliflower you might see that. So then it would be, you would have a little resistance, but not much. So those are two terms that might confuse you, and hopefully I've clarified that a little bit. Okay, two other terms that might confuse people are simmering and boiling. So simmering is when there are little bubbles that slowly come up and reach the surface, and they just, hey, you know, casual, I'm here. Yep, I'm simmering, don't worry about me. Boiling, I'm sure most of us know what boiling is. It's a very rapid bubble. So it's like, hey, we're here, we're ready to go, let's go. That's boiling. Simmering is more laid back. So usually simmering is you'll put something on a medium low to low and just let it do its thing. Boiling is much higher typically, and you want it to be like very agitated. Stirring in a recipe can sometimes throw people off. There are a few different ways you might see stirring come up. Some might say stir constantly because, like, if you're making, like, say, a caramel sauce, you need to keep that stirring so the bottom doesn't burn. You also might see stir continuously, and again, that's like constantly, where you're just going to keep going. Frequently means you can give it 2 or 3 minutes, come back, stir it around just to make sure the bottom's not burning. Sometimes you'll see people write intermittently. I've seen that in a few recipes online. That's basically the same as frequently. It just means, you know, every few minutes, come by and stir it up a bit. Now back to the subject of the ingredients. There are some people who might worry when they see just eggs. Wait, is that a large egg, extra large egg, medium egg? If a recipe says just eggs, it's referring to a large egg. That's the standard egg that you would use. Ina Garten, I know she uses extra large eggs in her recipes, the Barefoot Contessa. So in her recipes, she will acknowledge that she wants you to use extra large eggs. But typically, if you just see eggs, they are expecting you to use a large egg. Also, brown sugar. If it says simply brown sugar, is it light or dark brown sugar? Typically, that is light brown sugar. You could probably substitute dark brown sugar, but you will have a more intense molasses type of flavor. So typically, if it simply says brown sugar, it means light brown sugar. If it says flour, just flour, it's talking about all-purpose flour because that's the standard flour. If it wants you to use anything else like cake flour or bread flour or semolina flour, it'll let you know specifically. So if you see just flour, they're talking about all-purpose flour. If you see just sugar, it's talking about granulated sugar, the regular white sugar. It's not talking about brown sugar, although again, you could possibly replace it. But especially in baked goods, you have to be careful with replacing things because brown sugar is much moister than granulated sugar. So granulated sugar may be making your cookie more crisp. And if you substitute brown sugar, it's losing some of that crispness because of the moisture content in the brown sugar. So if it says just sugar, expect to use granulated sugar. Also, if it says salt, use table salt. Otherwise, kosher salt would be specified. And I've mentioned this numerous times in my videos. Kosher salt is about half as strong as table salt because the crystals are much larger. So if you have a recipe that says 1 teaspoon of kosher salt, but you only have table salt, use half as much of the table salt as you would kosher. And vice versa. If you have only kosher salt and the recipe calls for table salt, use twice as much. So if it's a half teaspoon of table salt, use a teaspoon of kosher salt. Another thing obviously to pay attention to, just under the title of the recipe, the name of the recipe, should be the servings. Sometimes the serving size, sometimes not. Most of the time not. But that'll just give you an idea of how many people this can serve, and then you can portion it out in that way. You can double if you need more. You can sometimes halve it if you need less. Just make sure you check to see how many servings to make sure that it's what you need for whatever you are cooking for. Okay, sometimes a recipe will call for certain equipment. Make sure you have that equipment on hand. There are some pieces of equipment that are interchangeable. You could use a stick blender instead of a regular blender. You could probably even use a food processor in place of a blender. Although in using a food processor instead of a blender, you have to make sure if it's something liquid that you don't go over. There is typically a liquid line on the food processor, and you should not go over that level with anything liquid, because as it processes, if it's above that line, it's indicating it's going to probably splatter out or make a mess. So you just have to be careful that if you are using a food processor instead of a blender or stick blender, do not go past the liquid line. There's almost always a little liquid line on the bowl of the food processor. And like I said, I will keep a pen handy when I'm looking at a recipe. Just write down notes. Say that if you didn't like something, you can make a note, you can change it up. And that leads me into making adjustments to recipes. I always suggest, unless you really don't like an ingredient, that you make it the way it was written the first time. And then you can see, oh, I didn't like this had too much of that, and you can adjust then. But typically the first time I would suggest just doing it as the recipe says. Unless, say, you don't like peas and the recipe has peas. You can most likely easily swap out corn or some other vegetable. So I'm not talking about necessarily things like that, but it is always best to make it once the way it's written and then play around with it and make notes on your recipe what you would change. Now, especially with baked goods, you don't want to veer too much from the recipe the way it's written, because as I said before, baking is a very precise science. Things are there for a reason. So you can't just willy-nilly change things up. Oh, you could change the chocolate chips to nuts in a cookie, but as far as the flour, the butter, the whatever it is, the ratios are there for a reason. You can replace items to make them lower in bites, points, calories, fat, what have you. And I will go over that in a second. But typically, it is best to adhere to whatever the proportions are that they have measured out, because you could go from having a waffle to having a pancake just based on a few little adjustments. They're not the same batter, though they're very close. There are subtle differences. So those differences are what makes, say, a scone different from a muffin. So just know that those proportions are there for a reason in baked goods, and I would suggest not veering away from the measurements that they have. Now, for substitutions, I do a lot of substituting of sugar, of high fat, high point items, and there are things that I have learned that you can sub out. Some things it will work in, some things it won't, but typically These are some substitutions that I use on a regular basis. Now, if something calls for oil, I'm not going to use oil in my baked goods, so I will replace that with one of three things: unsweetened applesauce, pumpkin puree, or mashed banana. Now, there are some people who have also used the unsweetened applesauce and the banana as a substitute for sugar or like honey. I haven't done that, so I don't know how that would work, but I have used them as replacements for the oil, and that does work well. For buttermilk, buttermilk is an acidic ingredient that adds, especially like buttermilk pancakes, adds a nice texture, a nice flavor, a nice little hint of sourness to it. If you don't have like a low fat, low point buttermilk, or if you don't, like me, I don't want to buy buttermilk that's just going to sit in my fridge and go bad, because they sell them only in quarts and not in smaller sizes. So what I will do to replace buttermilk, I will use 3/4 part of almond milk and 1/4 part of non-fat Greek yogurt. So say it was a cup of buttermilk. I would do 3/4 cup of almond milk, 1/4 cup of non-fat Greek yogurt, whisk those things together. And again, if they're at room temperature, they will whisk together much more easily. Now for cream, if something calls for cream, I will make a half and half mixture of the almond milk and the yogurt, because cream is obviously thicker, so I can get away with using a little bit more of the yogurt and it'll give it that creamy feel. So if it was, again, 1 cup of cream, I'd use 1/2 cup of almond milk and 1/2 cup of non-fat Greek yogurt. Sour cream, I'm sure we all know sour cream is just a pure replacement for non-fat Greek yogurt. I don't make any alterations to that. I just use Greek yogurt as my sour cream, and baked potatoes, in cooking, whatever, works perfectly. Also for mayonnaise, I might use a light mayo, but just to make sure I keep those points and bites down, I might put in half of the mayo as Greek yogurt. So like if I make my chicken salad, I might use a tablespoon of the mayo, the light mayo, and then another tablespoon of the Greek yogurt, just so I keep those bites and points down. Now for ricotta, there are low-fat, non-fat ricottas out there, but the thing I found the best, and if you've seen this channel before, I did a cannoli, I also did a ricotta pasta, and I use non-fat cottage cheese. And I know a lot of people do not, I hate the texture of cottage cheese because those little curds just creep me out. So what I do is I put it in my mini food processor or a blender or what have you, and I blend it up until it's a creamy ricotta-like mixture. You don't see any of those curds anymore. You don't really get that texture at all once you've pureed it. So turn your non-fat cottage cheese into ricotta. Trust me, I would not eat cottage cheese if my life depended on it, but if I puree it, I will. If there is a recipe that calls for bacon or any sort of pork, always get center cut. Center cut is the lowest for bites, points, calories, etc. It's leaner than the rest of it, so anytime I have bacon, I get center cut bacon, because that would be a 1 bite, 1 point strip of bacon. It's usually a true 1 bite until you maybe eat quite a few of them. Or you could go with turkey bacon, but if you really want the true bacon experience, you can easily go for center cut bacon and not feel guilty about it whatsoever. I have it all the time. For peanut butter, you can easily replace it with some powdered peanut butter like PB2, PB Fit. What I typically do, I will mix mine together with sugar-free maple syrup. So that way it gets that consistency, it gets a little sweetness. You don't really taste the maple in there. It just helps make it thick and creamy, just like regular peanut butter. And butter, typically will use light butter. I've recently been hearing a lot of people substituting butter with avocado. I haven't tried this yet. It definitely sounds intriguing depending on the recipe that you're using it in, but it's definitely got good fats in there. I don't know points and bites wise, especially with this new WW program coming up, how that would compare, but I typically just use light butter. If you do decide to try substituting avocado for the butter, it is recommended that you use half as much. So say it was a tablespoon of butter, you would use half a tablespoon of avocado, mashed up, pureed, whatever. So that wraps up this lesson on reading recipes and things that you might need to know. If I didn't cover something that you were curious about or that you want to know about, ask me down in the comments section because I will definitely give you an answer. Like I said, this wouldn't be a comprehensive list. I'm sure I've missed something, but this is a good overall base for how to read recipes and what you should take away from it, what you should be looking for. So if you liked this back to basics tutorial on reading recipes, I hope you'll give me a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet and you are looking for recipes that can help you on a weight loss journey. And also I just put out a giveaway video for my subscribers. So if you subscribe, go back and look at the giveaway video. It's going to end November 13th at 6 p.m. And so you still have time to get in on it if you'd like to. So go check that out. It was just in Saturday's video, and I will link it down in the description box as well. And hit the notification bell for the next time I upload any sort of video like my giveaway or like this one or like the Halloween collab we just did yesterday. And again, comment down below if there is anything that you would like to know about reading recipes that I haven't covered. And like I said, next week I will be covering measurements. So if the question has to do with measuring, wait until next week because I may answer it then. So I hope you will follow me over on social media. Here's my Instagram handle. And there are 2 Facebook groups that I'm a part of. One is mine, Recipes with Roy. The other one is Finding Our Way, W-E-I-G-H, and I co-admin that with Jennifer Lynn from the Jennifer Lynn channel, as well as Bree Coleman from Balancing Life with Bree. So I hope you found this helpful. I hope you learned at least something that you didn't know before. And again, like I said, just ask down below if there's something I didn't cover that you're curious about. So that does it for this tutorial. So until next time, bye.